Hey guys, in this video I want to introduce you to Latin verbs. And I don't want you to be intimidated by words like conjugation or to conjugate or to parse. Those are terms that we'll have to use over and over, and I want you to understand what they mean. I also want you to understand basically how Latin verbs work. Now, the thing that makes Latin verbs so interesting but also somewhat frustrating is the fact that they change their endings all the time. We call that inflection. Now, English verbs are also inflected, but they're not as inflected as Latin verbs. So, for instance, if I write the sentence, he jumps on the board, here's my verb, and here's my subject. But if I want to change that subject from third person, he, to second person, you, then I have to change the ending. I have to get rid of the S. That's called inflection. Or if I want to make this verb past tense, I have to add an ed to the end of this word. He jumped. So here we see three different endings on the same verb. We have an S, we have sort of a non-ending, and then we have an ed. That's inflection. And then we're going to learn a lot of different endings for Latin verbs because Latin verbs are much more highly inflected than English verbs. We'll learn present tense endings and imperfect tense endings and future tense endings, and down the road even some other tenses. We'll learn that the ending on a Latin verb not only changes when you change the tense, but when you move the subject from being singular to plural, or from first person to second person, and so on. We're going to have to learn a lot of endings for our verbs. And when you conjugate a Latin verb, all that means is to write the verb out with all of its endings. So when you take one verb and you write it out in all of its possible forms, that's conjugating the verb. Now, parsing a verb is kind of doing the opposite. It's taking one form of the verb, looking at the ending, and then drawing out, decoding it, and giving all the information that you can based upon the form and the ending of the verb. So to conjugate a verb is to write a verb out of all of its forms. To parse a verb is to take one form of the verb and decode that verb based upon its ending and give all the information that you can. And then the last word that you need to understand is the word conjugation. What we'll also see is that verbs in Latin, like verbs in English, follow particular patterns. So for instance, we call this a regular pattern for an English verb. We form the past tense by simply adding an ed. But we know that there are some verbs in English that don't follow that pattern. We call them irregular, but in reality we could probably identify some sort of pattern. So if I had written he runs, the past tense would not be he run, but it would be he ran. That's a different category of verb from jump. Well, in Latin we call our different categories of verbs, we call them conjugations. So by looking at a verb, we can tell what pattern it follows, what group it belongs in, what conjugation it belongs to. We should be able, based upon knowing its conjugation and knowing our endings, we should be able to conjugate that particular verb and write it out in all of its forms. And then lastly, we should be able to take an individual form of the verb, look at the ending, decode it, and write down all the information about it. That's called parsing the verb. I hope this video is helpful to you, and I'm excited that we're going to get to spend time learning more about Latin verbs and the Latin language in general.